Department goes on to say that during this action, an entire fleet of Axis submarines was destroyed by American dive bombers, affording the troop ships a safe crossing.
On the mighty mission, praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition, and we'll on.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, what's the best way to combat anti-Semitism? Well, for a group of American cartoonists beginning in the 1930s, the answer was to put anti-Semites on the defensive. Through a series of single-panel and story-length comics published in newspapers and distributed to military bases, classrooms, and labor unions, these cartoonists spread the message that anti-Semitism wasn't just bad for Jews, but was bad for America and the values upon which it stands. Our guest has documented this covert campaign to educate the populace with socially significant comments.
We're honored to chat with Dr. Rafael Medoff, founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies based in Washington, D.C. He's the author of more than 20 books, including Whistleblowers, 4 Who Fought to Expose the Holocaust to America, and his latest, Cartoonists Against Racism, The Secret Jewish War on Bigotry, published by Dark Horse and Yo Books. Rafael, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Your book uncovers efforts to combat racism and anti-Semitism through comic book stories and political cartoons during the 1930s and 40s, a time of heated and xenophobic and anti-Semitic rhetoric in the U.S. How did that secret campaign come about?
It was first a response to the Kristallnacht pogrom in Nazi Germany in 1938. You know, American Jews read about those horrors in Germany, but for the first time, many in the leadership of the American Jewish community began to wonder, could those outrages be repeated even in the United States? That led a prominent Jewish defense organization, the American Jewish Committee, to enlist a marketing executive by the name of Richard Rothschild in the hope that he could devise, through his expertise in communications, new ways to combat anti-Semitism so that it could not, so something like Kristallnacht could not be repeated here in America.
You mentioned Richard Rothschild, the advertising executive behind the campaign, who was careful not to single out Jew hatred, which might be easily ignored or even inflame further anti-Semitism. Instead, the cartoons discredited all forms of racial, religious, and ethnic bigotry, with Jew hatred being one of them. Were you surprised by how perceptive and modern Rothschild's strategy was?
You know, there have always been different approaches to combating anti-Semitism. That was true in the 1940s and 1950s when this campaign led by Rothschild was undertaken, and it's true today as well. There are those who advocate fighting anti-Semitism without any connection to other forms of bigotry. And then there are those at the other end of the spectrum who argue that the fight against anti-Semitism should be subsumed within a broader, universal struggle against all racism. Richard Rothschild and the American Jewish Committee chose a kind of a middle path. The comic book artists and cartoonists whom Rothschild enlisted for this campaign created artwork and comic book stories in which they challenged anti-Semitism, but also other forms of bigotry, racism against African Americans, racism against other ethnic and religious groups, and looked at them all as part of the same kind of problem. In other words, they looked at tolerance as the goal, and so all these different types of manifestations of racism against different groups as all pieces to that puzzle. And I wouldn't say that it's clear that they were right in their approach, But as a historian, I look at it and I try to understand why they approached the problem as they did. My co-author, Craig Yo, and I looked at the historical context in which this unique struggle took place. The fact that they brought comic book artists and cartoonists and animators into this struggle makes it a very unique part of both comic book and cartooning history, as well as American Jewish history.
I was going to ask you if either of those approaches are more effective, the broad approach grouping anti-Semitism with other forms of bigotry, or just focusing on anti-Semitism. In your historical view, are either of them even effective at all? I know anti-Semitism doesn't seem to go away.
These things are very hard to measure. Historians spend a lot of time studying exactly those questions, and it's very difficult to come up with a definitive answer. Certainly, Richard Rothschild believed that the campaign was successful. Craig Yo and I looked at Rothschild's later reminiscences about the campaign, and Rothschild was very optimistic. Surveying the changes in American society in the 1950s and 1960s, Rothschild, looking back, concluded that their campaign must have had some effect because America did become a much more tolerant society. Racial segregation was abolished, important civil rights legislation was enacted, and of course, much more recently, we've had an African-American president twice, and now a Black vice president. So America clearly has come a long way. To what extent the Rothschild cartoonist campaign contributed to it is hard to say. On the other hand, they created comic book stories that were read by millions of young Americans, posters that were seen in labor union halls all around the country, comic strips that were read in newspapers. They had a hand in the Superman radio show 16-part series in which Superman fought against Ku Klux Klan. Imagine how many people listened to that extremely popular radio show. So when we try to assess the factors that contribute to the changes in American society, I think as a historian, it would be surprising if the comic book cartoon campaign did not have some impact, but measuring it more precisely is difficult. And I think all we can say really is they fought the good fight. They did the right thing. These cartoonists and comic book artists, they were struggling, using their pens as swords in a noble cause. And I'm sure that it contributed in some way to the gradual betterment of American society.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. One of the more successful efforts was the comic book story They Got the Blame, a history of scapegoating adapted by cartoonist Sam Glankoff. Could you tell us about that comic and its impact?
They Got the Blame was an interesting attempt to talk about the dangers of scapegoating. So in the story, we see examples throughout history of different religious and racial groups who were targeted, who got the blame, so to speak. There's a number of panels there about the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany, but as well racism against other racial and religious groups in many different countries. And it was produced not only in True Comics, but it was then reprinted as a giveaway and reached an enormous audiences. It was not the only anti-racism or anti-bigotry comic book story, but it was it's significant because its specific purpose was to discredit scapegoating in the minds of American youngsters, so that kids growing up in the 1950s would emerge from an environment in which they read about the dangers of racism, bigotry, and gradually inculcated those values so that American society would improve in those areas, as indeed it did.
It does seem that comic books in general had kind of broadly this kind of agenda of, supporting the little guy and exposing the evils of authoritarianism.
I suppose you could say that, broadly speaking, that's really what superheroes are all about. Not only combating crime, but you're rescuing innocent people from evildoers. in Cartoonists Against Racism, we reprinted the entire They Got the Blame strip, but also an entire full-color story of a Golden Age superhero, the Green Llama, in which he battles some nasty types who very much resemble the Ku Klux Klan. And these are good examples of how comic book storytelling could be put to use for a higher purpose than just entertainment. Obviously, comics were enormously entertaining, and there was such an incredible variety of types. As you note, EC in some ways became infamous for its controversial horror comics, but at the same time, there were many EC comics that were pioneering in the worlds of science fiction, even some with important social messages. So comics have served that great purpose all these years, both entertainment and in some ways education, in some way a mix of the two. And in Cartoonists Against Racism, what we do is we delve into that interesting world of comics and cartoonists who had a kind of a higher purpose. So yeah, it's the Green Llama, but it's the Green Llama fighting a bunch of bigots, and that's something that's kind of inspiring, really, when we look back and see that comic book artists could play that kind of role.
Among the memorable cartoons are ones written and drawn by Carl Rose, who had worked as an editorial cartoonist for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Rose did a series featuring Mr. Bigot, spelled with 2 G's and 2 T's, whose outdated and overtly racist remarks exposed the absurdity of bigotry. He even had a cobweb hanging from the back of his head, emphasizing just how antiquated his views were. In one cartoon, he's sitting behind a desk telling a Native American, "I'm sorry, Mr. Eagle Feather, but our company's policy is to employ 100% Americans only." Mr. Bigot is sort of a prototype for Archie Bunker, who would appear on TV a quarter century later. Bigotry is always old-fashioned, and yet it never goes away. Why do you think that is?
Of course, it's a little bit over the top with this very thinly disguised name of the lead character, and as you know, the cobwebs hang off the back of his head. But unlike some of the other aspects of the Rothschild American Jewish Committee campaign, in this case, these cartoons by Carl Rose were placed in newspapers around the country as editorial cartoons. So these were not aimed at children. And it's important to emphasize, while comic books in those days were primarily read by youngsters, daily newspapers with their regular editorial cartoons were not. So this was an attempt to reach an older audience with a somewhat more sophisticated approach. Each of the Mr. Bigot cartoons is your classic one-panel editorial cartoon, but with very pointed messages, like the one you mentioned with the Native American. Now, as to the broader question, how is it that racism and bigotry persist despite the good efforts of people like Rothschild and his stable of cartoonists and comic book artists? Some of those cartoonists, by the way, were Pulitzer Prize winners. How is it that racism manages to survive? Well, I suppose that's a question for psychiatrists and sociologists, not so much for historians. But again, it strikes me that it's important to remember the great strides that we have made. When you note that Mr. Bigot was kind of a precursor to Archie Bunker. Well, the whole point of the Archie Bunker character in the 1970s sitcom All in the Family was, in fact, to ridicule bigotry. So he was set up there to make bigotry look foolish. And that was another very important contribution through the medium of popular culture to combat racism. It does, of course, persist. Racism still persists in American society. It emerges in different forms. Anti-Semitism in the 1940s and 50s, when Rothschild and his colleagues were fighting it, was primarily coming from the political far right. That has changed a great deal. Today, we see a lot of anti-Semitism coming from the extreme end, the other end of the political spectrum. So bigotry takes different forms. It sometimes comes from surprising sources. We did not expect necessarily to have a giant upsurge in anti-Semitism from the radical left. But here we are. Ultimately, the best way to combat it is through the kinds of societal safeguards that we have, law and order, Constitution, but in the end, every country's lifestyle is a product of its citizens. So we depend on the goodwill and the reason of the majority of our fellow citizens to guide us through turbulent times like these, so that we come out ahead. On the whole, I think we can look back to the 1950s and say that American society is much more progressive and enlightened today than it was then. But with, of course, our flaws. We're all human beings, and it will take more time and more dedication by the next generation to keep things moving in the right direction.
Did these cartoons perhaps contribute to decreasing anti-Semitism in the U.S. after World War II?
Historians agree that there was a significant reduction in anti-Semitism in America after World War II. Now, there were a number of obvious reasons that contributed to that change. First of all, America had just concluded a massive world war against the greatest exponent of anti-Semitism in the world, Nazi Germany. So the ideas of Nazi Germany were, of course, widely discredited. That was one factor. Second was the general economic prosperity of the post-war era, which naturally led to a certain relaxation in tensions between ethnic groups. The civil rights struggle, that is the fight for the rights of African Americans, focused a lot of the public's attention on the problem of racism in American society. With anti-Semitism on the decrease, but with African Americans fighting for their rights, that naturally became a focus also for the American Jewish community. And many American Jews played a prominent role in the civil rights struggle of those years. So the process by which anti-Semitism was fought was one in which there were a variety of factors. Rothschild believed that the comic books and comic book stories and cartoons contributed to that, and it probably did. Rothschild was very sensitive about the impact that the cartoons were having, even at the time. Some of the cartoon material was shown in advance to small groups of people, and they had sociologists ask them questions to kind of gauge their reaction before the cartoons were actually distributed to newspapers or labor unions or other outlets. But those studies tended to be inconclusive. Craig Yo and I looked at the Rothschild's files, and we saw the raw material from the studies, and it was clear that people would look at, like, for example, those Mr. Bigot cartoons and come away with a variety of reactions that didn't always serve as a helpful guide to the Rothschild people. Sometimes they just had to use their instincts. And again, they were reaching out through a variety of media. I've mentioned newspapers for editorial cartoons, comic books for comic book stories, the Superman radio show. They were also involved in promoting some anti-racism animated shorts, which can still be found on YouTube, and they're very interesting. The animation was fairly sophisticated for that era, but it's the messaging that's really the most important.
The first people on Earth knew only a very small section of it. They lived close together and looked alike. But pretty soon they started to spread out. And as they drifted further apart, little differences began to appear. Most of the people of the world kept the same in-between color as their ancestors, and still do. But three groups on the very edges of the world population developed distinct differences in color. These exceptional groups gave rise to our idea of three separate races of mankind.
Well, there are other differences in people besides the skin color.
So in Cartoonists Against Racism, we're showcasing a variety of different types of interesting artwork and different approaches to communicating anti-racism and anti-Semitism messages to various viewing audiences. The struggle against anti-Semitism, however, continues, despite Rothschild's best efforts, and despite that post-war decrease. Nonetheless, later in the 1960s and 70s, and up until our own era, there have been eruptions of anti-Semitism in different ways, and sometimes even more recently, eruptions that were violent, such as the massacre of synagogue members in Pittsburgh just a few years ago. So it's a problem that will probably not go away, but this is true really in every society where there are problems of bigotry, and the goal always should be to push the extremists, the racists, the anti-Semites to the margins of society. You'll never convince everyone to give up their old prejudices, but if you can discredit them and keep them on the margins, that is, treat bigots as pariahs, then you will not have to worry about them actually getting to the point of being able to influence our government policy making or our school curriculum. So I think that really, and I think that's really a reasonable goal. That's something that can be gradually achieved. But the idea of completely stamping out anti-Semitism or other types of racism strikes me as unrealistic.
A vocal critic of the cartoon campaign was Dr. Frederick Wortham, the now infamous psychiatrist who was convinced that comics contributed to juvenile delinquency and led a vigorous attack on the comic book industry. Wortham, who was Jewish, criticized the American Jewish Committee for using the comics medium to spread its message. Of course, Wortham was wrong about a lot of things. He called Superman a fascist, for instance. But did others object to the use of anti-racist cartoons, perhaps for other reasons?
No. My co-author and I did not find any evidence of organized opposition. Dr. Wortham's criticism is unique and kind of strange, really. He didn't object to the message, to the anti-racism themes of the material. He simply objected to the fact they were being reprinted or used in comic books, which he regarded as essentially evil. So he was more concerned in this case about the messenger than the message. The Rothschild campaign included creating one-page social service messages, which were then published in many comic books as advertisements, but again used the comic book storytelling format and used famous superheroes like Superman, Batman, and others to transmit messages about tolerance. DC Comics agreed to run these ads in their entire line of comic books for many years in the 50s and early 60s, and that enabled anti-racism messages to reach additional millions of young people. And that was a very important part of the Rothschild campaign in reaching such a significant larger audience. So DC's cooperation was extremely important. The movie industry and the radio industry was not as receptive, with the notable exception of the Superman 16-part Superman series that I mentioned. So the Rothschild campaign focused primarily on print media, on major daily newspapers, comic books, and also many of these comics and cartoons that we reprint in Cartoonists Against Racism were published as separate booklets and were given away in various venues. So all in all, it was an enormous campaign. It involved the production of millions of posters and leaflets and cartoons and comic books over a very long period. I noted that this campaign began in the aftermath of the 1938 pogrom in Nazi Germany. So it began in early 1939 and continued all the way until the early 1960s. So that's a lot of below the radar, so to speak, anti-racism campaigning. When I say below the radar, I don't mean that the material was below the radar. Obviously, the opposite. The whole point was to have a public campaign. But I mean, the role of the American Jewish Committee and Richard Rothschild was very much below the radar. They made a strategic decision at the very beginning of this campaign to keep the fact of Jewish sponsorship out of the limelight. They were concerned that if it appeared that a Jewish organization was organizing, creating, and distributing this material, that it would seem self-interested and therefore might discredit the value of the work. So the fact that the American Jewish Committee was behind all this work was not known at the time, and in fact, it was not really known to historians until the publication of our book.
Many of the cartoons seem like they could have been made today. For instance, in 1945's The Green Llama Smashes the Plot Against America, the Green Llama swoops into a Klan meeting and grabs a Klan member who protests, "You can't do this, I got rights." To which the Green Llama replies, "I've noticed that you fellows who want to do away with the rights of others are always quick to yell about your own." You include footnotes connecting events and sentiments from these old comics to our modern day. Why was it important to make these connections?
My co-author and I felt that the importance of Cartoonists Against Racism is not merely to discuss a fascinating episode in comic book history, and equally fascinating for American history, but also because the materials and the lessons are relevant for our own times. So we did not approach this merely as a comics historian and a Jewish historian, but also as concerned human beings. We would like to see readers of Cartoonists Against Racism learn from this book some important kind of timeless lessons about how the struggle against bigotry is just as important today as it was then. And that cartoonists and comic book artists today can still play a role in these kinds of important undertakings for the betterment of society.
Thank you so much, Rafael, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.